Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. This webinar is being recorded. I want to officially welcome you to the Color of COVID series. I am your webinar series moderator, Dr. Keon Gilbert. I'm an associate professor at St. Louis University in the College for Public Health and Social Justice, and also one of the co-directors of the Institute for Healing Justice and Equity. We are sponsoring this particular series. This is the third part of the Color of COVID series, and we welcome you and thank you for your participation. Next slide. This particular webinar is focusing on COVID-19 vaccines. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare a number of social, health, and economic inequalities in American society. Not only are there racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 infections and deaths, but also the pandemic has exacerbated the economic inequalities suffered by poor and middle class. As the federal and state governments start to think about and debate Moderna, Pfizer, BioNtech, and the AzstraZeneca vaccines, this rush to approve and distribute COVID-19 vaccines, they must ensure that they do not further exacerbate any inequalities. We have several panelists here with us to talk about these issues, and we welcome your comments and your questions. We would like for everyone to use the Q&A feature to send questions. We will try to get to those questions either in real time or use those questions to ask, to pose to each of our panelists. Again, we want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. And with that, I'll start with some quick introductions and then we'll go into our panel discussions. Before I do that, we want to just briefly give you a little information about the Institute for Healing Justice. Other co-founders include Kira Hudson Banks, Amber Johnson, and Yearby, and our program director, Michelle Rossmeyer, who is helping us to navigate all of the intricacies of Zoom webinar features. As you can see, our email address, Twitter, and website are located on the slide. We'll also have a slide at the end of the presentation with all of the panelists with their email addresses. So you can direct questions to them there, or also, again, use the Q&A feature. Thank you again, and we'll move to the next slide. Our first panelist, Anna Santos Rutschman, is a professor in the St. Louis University School of Law, and a member of the Center for Health Law Studies. Currently was recently asked to join President-elect Joe Biden's COVID-19 Innovation Committee. Some areas of expertise and interest include health law, intellectual property, health and drug law. Our second panelist will be Harald Schmidt, faculty member, assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. Also is a research associate in the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics, a senior fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute. Areas of interest include improving opportunity and reducing disadvantage for marginalized populations in health promotion and healthcare priority settings. And our last panelist is Professor Ruqaiijah Yearby, professor of law at the St. Louis University School of Law and member of the Center for Health Law, co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Healing Justice. Areas of expertise include racial health disparities, long-term care, direct care workers, the CARES Act, and civil rights law and policy. I want to take this time to welcome and thank each of our panelists for joining us today. And we'll get started with our first presentation with Anna Santos Rutschman. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Keon, and thank you, organizers, for putting together this this panel. I'm at the law school, as Keon mentioned, and I spend most of my time thinking about two things. One, patents, and two, FDI. And specifically, I work in the area of vaccines, and I think you know how timely it is to be looking into these areas as we have vaccines that were developed very, very quickly, possibly coming to market within a couple of weeks, it seems, here in the US. So I thought what I could do today is to talk a little bit about patents and explain why they matter in this context, but in particular, if you're worried about inequalities in general, and particularly, the title of this webinar series, the color of COVID, if these are the types of inequalities that are, in your mind right now and that you're worried about, I would make the case that you should really care about the effects of patents, not just on COVID-19 vaccines, but on what's to come. So I'll explain what I mean by this, and then I'll end with a brief comment about how the FDA piece of the puzzle, which we're all waiting to see what FDA has to say today after their meeting, but how the FDA piece of the puzzle ties into the patent puzzle. So I'm going to sort of bet that most of you, and already the slide pointed, towards the 3 leading vaccine candidates right now, but you've heard the words Pfizer, Moderna, very often over the last couple weeks, if not months, right? And the reason we talk so much about these vaccines, it's not merely because they're the first ones that are going to come to market and hopefully help us get to the end of the pandemic faster. They're really important because they are new things in the universe of vaccines. So literally up until now, and the AzstraZeneca vaccine is going to fit in the older model, but up until now, we pretty much took a little piece of the virus and we did something to it, and then we injected it on a human being, and we triggered an immune reaction. This is what the polio vaccines did 70 years ago, and this is what vaccines have been doing in a way or another since then. That's how we've made them. We've made some progress, but the technology hasn't really changed. What these new vaccines are doing is something that has never been done before. So they're completely new technologies. They're completely new products. So they're actually taking a piece of they're a set of instructions. First, we're not taking any virus or anything. They're just a set of instructions for our bodies to manufacture a particular type of protein. And then the bodies will react, our bodies will react to that. And the immune reaction is triggered. And we do this, so the word you might have heard is mRNA. Which is a form of DNA that we use to provide these instructions, but this is a much less messy process that these companies are now using, which is going to make vaccine making much cheaper, much faster, and potentially much more accurate. And I'm bombarding you with this information because I think understanding how new this is critical, and this is why. If you've heard the story of the polio vaccine never having had a patent on it, because Jonas Salk, this is like the sun, you don't patent the sun, you don't patent something that's life-saving, that's actually not accurate. The vaccine was not patented because the lawyers told Jonas Salk and the university there was nothing to patent. I mean, the technology was not patent worthy. It was relatively simple and had been in use. It just put a bunch of stuff together. Great accomplishment from public health perspective, but not from a patent perspective. That's not the case with these vaccines. These vaccines are going to be covered by layers and layers of patents. What that means is that for up to 20 years, the companies that have these patents are going to be dominating the market and potentially charging higher prices for these vaccines. Now, they really don't care about the vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic from a profit perspective. Contract law has solved that for them. There's plenty of demand for these vaccines. They're going to make some profit. It's not going to be particularly meaningful from an economic perspective for these companies. So they will probably have a price tag attached to them that's not as high as the price tags that we have seen for recent vaccines, like HPV vaccines and the like. But what's really going to matter is what they're going to do with these patents come the next COVID-19, and even more than that, when they start using this technology, which now they're able to target other types of diseases. And some of these companies are now using this type of technology to target things like solid tumors and to be able to manufacture vaccines for those things. And all of that is going to be covered in patents. And what we know from many other areas in patent is that every time companies have this sort of robust patent protection and they price their goods at incredibly super competitive prices, it is naturally the economic and socioeconomic disadvantaged populations that are excluded from accessing these life-saving goods. So what we know from the history of patent law is that it's going to be populations of color, and which ironically are the ones in the context of COVID are shouldering the burden of disease the most. These are going to be the populations that, if they're super competitive pricing, and we can almost promise you that is going to happen because that's economics 101 and the law is sanctioning this. So it is going to be traditionally rural populations and disadvantaged populations that are going to be shouldering access problems the most, again, which is obviously unfair, but it's the system that patent law has created. To wrap this up and explain how patent law now ties into bigger problems that I think my co-panelists will talk about, it doesn't really mean, having a patent doesn't mean that you can automatically commercialize a vaccine. The last word actually comes from the FDA. So the FDA or the EMA in Europe, they're sort of the gatekeeper, and they'll tell you, we don't care that you have a patent really, but you need regulatory approval from us. So they will be okaying, we think, COVID-19 vaccines. But because we think collectively, and I personally don't think this, but our legislatures think that whoever gets FDA approval should get some sort of reward on top of these patents, because vaccines are biologics. FDA is going to give 12 years of market exclusivity to the sponsors of these vaccines. So for 12 years, FDA will be barred by the law from approving any competitors that look at this technology that's now, going to be pretty much in the public domain. And they're going to say, even if competitors are able to come to market from a scientific perspective, FDA will be statutorily prohibited from approving anything similar for 12 years. And of course, that's going to accentuate pricing issues and economic disparities. And very last comment, I talked about patents, I talked about FDA. One of the things that's common between these two areas is that patents are granted by the PTO, by the Patent and Trademark Office, which is entirely dependent on user fees. So industry that's seeking patents is paying the PTO to exist. And FDA is not exclusively dependent on user fees, but a chunk of its drug regulation budget also comes from user fees, again, from the same industry. So when you start thinking about things like that are adjacent to this, clinical trials, minority representation and the like, and you think about possible interventions, what should we be doing at the clinical trial level? Keep in mind that the agencies we're talking to are being funded by a very particular type of player, which is partly the reason we've not been able to solve some of the economic disparities I talked about. So I think I'll wrap it up here, and I look forward to the other presentations.
Anna, before you go, I just want to maybe ask one or two follow-up questions before we move.
Sure.
So I imagine that many people have as a question, and it's certainly been in the news, that the idea that this particular vaccine is going to be free. So one question is that true that this vaccine will be free?
No, there are no free lunches anywhere, right? No, it is not going to be free. It is possible that it will come at no cost. And again, this is part of what I was talking about. The pharmaceutical companies sponsoring these vaccines, their interest in COVID vaccines per se is very marginal. So I don't think we're going to have incredibly super competitive pricing here. But somebody will have to pay for this, and this is going to be your health systems more likely than not. So it might come at no cost to to the populations that are indicated for the vaccine. That seems to be still on the table, but it doesn't get us out from having the profit that's not being made right now deferred to the next health good, dependent on this patented technology that the companies will bring to market. They will make sure that the price for that lunch will be reflected on the next health good we're going to need from that particular company using this technology.
Okay, there is one more question, and I also ask you all to use the Q&A feature for questions. If the vaccines are on the preventative list, won't insurers have to cover with no cost sharing to patients? And this will be the last question before we go to Harald.
Okay, so it kind of depends, because the system and both the reimbursement system and a number of other considerations that typically apply to vaccines and the way we bring them to market in the US might not be the system we're going to follow in the case of COVID-19, from my understanding with the people in the transition team right now. So we are poised to treat reimbursement, but even things like liability, for instance, for side effects, slightly different given the urgency of the outbreak. So that's my understanding from talking yesterday with the current advisors to the president-elect, that we will work so that the vaccine will be made available at no cost. But as you can imagine, this is an area that's in flux, and we might have some vaccines coming to market before the new administration is actually in. So it's an area in flux. I'm happy to discuss it further, but my current understanding is that the incoming administration intends to make it available at no cost immediately, right? So from that perspective.
Great, thank you, Anna. And now we'll turn to Harald Schmidt.
All right, who has successfully unmuted. I'm very pleased to have managed that bit. Thank you so much for having me, in particular to Ruqaiijah. I've only known Ruqaiijah for a little while, but already learned a lot from her. From patents to the people is, I guess, the transition here. Indeed, price can be a barrier, but I think it's clear that the consensus is that it should not be a barrier. One thing that certainly looms in the back here is that worse off people might face a barrier, a financial source to access an important vaccine, and that is something that's undesirable. I think there's really consensus that that must not be a barrier, but the important thing to appreciate too is that that's not the only barrier. And so the piece that I want to talk about is what the current thinking is in terms of prioritizing different population groups, and in particular considering disadvantage in societal disadvantage in access to vaccines. So just to orient you briefly, there's three main players that have been thinking about this or are very active in this space. The first is the CDC's ACIP committee, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. They, within the CDC, provide guidance to states and other jurisdictions on how to allocate vaccines. Their guidance is not binding, right? So this is purely guidance that is a recommendation. Importantly, before this work started, or actually while the ACIP was working on their guidance, the CDC and NIH together convened a committee by the national academies to advise the CDC on equitable vaccine allocation. And in the preface to that report published in October, there's a very important emphasis, which is that normally when we write reports at the academy, we start with science and then turn to ethics. Here we did it the other way around. And the reason is the disparate impact that COVID has had so far. And one thing that's really important to appreciate is that overall in the history of rationing, if you want, in crisis situations, there's a lot more acceptance of broadly utilitarian approaches to say, well, look, this is a bad situation and we just have to maximize benefits. Not everybody can be a winner here. And now, for the first time, I would really say in a very prominent way, do we appreciate that, well, if we do that, it turns out many people who are worse off, and in particular minority populations, will be disadvantaged again. It will compound the disadvantage that these groups have experienced so far, and that is not a good thing. So this is where the National Academies of Science and Medicine and Engineering was noteworthy in that they set out a priority system with different population groups arranged under different phases. That is largely risk-based and population level health driven, right? But in addition to that, they said within each of the phases, so let's say we have this consensus healthcare workers should go first. Within healthcare workers, there's more and less disadvantaged groups, right? So nurses are at more risk and both at work as well as on their way to and from work and at home typically, than very well off neurosurgeons who might be driving in their car to and from work, have much more sterile protections, less patient interactions, and can socially distance more easily at home. So the Academy said within each of the priority groups, we should prioritize using a measure of disadvantage, which happens to be something I've suggested in an early publication that I just put in the chat in the spring too. But here you see this articulated and inbuilt in a large allocation framework. So that's the advice that the National Academies gave to the CDC. Interestingly, the CDC has not really picked this up in quite the same way. A big difference between the two approaches is that while both are committed to reducing inequities, the recognition of social justice issues is certainly much stronger and comes through much more powerfully in the work of the national academies. Using this disadvantage index is one way, but it comes through in other ways. Now, the CDC wants to do that mainly through the sequencing of populations. So for example, one thing they have proposed recently, they have not yet voted on it, but the current thinking is that essential workers should be coming earlier than in the system that the National Academies proposed, because in large part, more minorities are among the essential worker group. So in principle, that's a good way that you could say we can also prioritize worse off people that way. But it ignores again that within essential workers too, there are people who are more at risk and who are less at risk, right? So those are two of the key players, but in a way, both of those are not really all that important because the ultimate decisions are going to be made by states. By the way, both of those have also said that price must not be a barrier, right? And there is really consensus on that. So of course the costs have to be picked up, but there is a consensus that people don't have to pay directly, should not have to pay directly. So what happens though ultimately is that states are the ones that decide in other jurisdictions who will actually have access to a vaccine. And with colleagues, I did a review of the initial state plans. And what's very interesting is that states are really picking up on this proposal. So for example, Tennessee has committed to set aside 10% of the allocation that the state receives and give that to their worse off quartile in the population as additional allocations, right? So very helpful for accountability, for planning, very clear commitment, is a very clear reference to the National Academies framework and not something that at the moment the CDC has also recommended. California has developed their own disadvantage index to both use that for allocating vaccines and importantly, also for monitoring uptake, right? Because let's bear this in mind, we're not just allocating vaccines once, but batch after batch after batch. And at every point, we have an opportunity to course correct. But we can only do that if we A, have a sense of what our course is, and B, if we have the data to know how are we in terms of hitting the course. And here, both Ohio actually and California have made commitments to that in that regard already. It's fairly straightforward in terms of data gathering to look at vaccine coverage, for example, by deciles on this, it's called a social vulnerability index, right? And if it turns out that better off people have a lot more vaccination coverage than worse off people, that is not a good thing, and we can course correct. And I'll flag one other reason why that's really important, and that is that the default model for states to receive new vaccines is that they must have used up their initial batch. And it's very reasonable, right? We want to avoid wastage. But put yourself in a state policy to make a position. The incentive is use your vaccines up quickly and do a lot for your people. But if you're now thinking of, African-American populations have very good reasons to be very skeptical of a healthcare system. And Ruqaiijah will talk more about that in a moment. If the incentive is to get vaccines out and used quickly, am I going to spend a lot of time planning outreach and communication strategies to work with groups who may need more persuasion? Or am I just going to say, look, I'll just get this out quickly because it's so important that everybody gets vaccinated? So the incentives are not structured that worse off people will be prioritized, and in particular, worse off minorities who have good historic reasons to be skeptical of a healthcare system. And here too, we see importantly that states are using disadvantage index to directly plan outreach communication activities as well as dispensing sites. So the action really now is where states are. And to leave it here, I'll just say that the main topics in rationing are, right, who gets it first in terms of the population group? Important question. How many vaccines do I give to each of these groups that I organize in the sequential sphere? Also important question. But even if you make big efforts in those two dimensions to prioritize worse off groups, as I have suggested on ethical, epidemiological, and economic grounds, all that is worth nothing if these groups don't take up the vaccines. And that's where disadvantage indices can also be really helpful for planning those activities, and in particular also for monitoring. And there may really be a case for disparate impact monitoring as we roll this out. So there's a lot of movement underway. I think we do have to cut states some slack because it's a tough operation to pull off, but it's really critical that as complex and as unique the situation is, equity doesn't fall by the wayside. I think there's encouraging signs that won't happen as badly as it will likely happen, but we shouldn't underestimate that one way of looking back at this in a decade might be, we did want to do something about equity, but it's just too complicated. And I think we all have to do everything we can to avoid that outcome.
Great, thank you, Harald. One quick follow-up question for you would be, What are some of the ways that are allowing or guiding states to make different decisions in terms of allocation?
So one is states are completely free to set up their priority groups, right? So on this essential worker situation, for example, states can also bring them earlier, as CDC says. And then the other is this, following the example of Tennessee, for example, to say, we have heard the word of the national academies, and we will just set aside a portion of the vaccines that are allocated to us and offer these in addition to what worse off communities would be offered proportionate to a population. Because since we have scarcity, that will mean there's less scarcity among worse off groups than we otherwise would have. And we have models that states are doing that.
Okay. And there's one question from our participants. Would a better population outcome be achieved by vaccinating older individuals before individuals working in healthcare, since a majority of individuals needing critical care in hospitals are older individuals? And this is addressing exceeding hospital capacity.
Yeah, so that's a really, really important and complicated question. So the current sequence is that healthcare workers should be first, then people in long-term care facilities, and the CDC currently has not yet finalized guidance from there on, right? But the point about, well, one way of thinking about this is, where do you avoid most deaths, for example? And this is something that the CDC has modeled, where it turns out it isn't that much of a difference. So the question is, who's incurring the deaths? And one way of looking at prioritizing older population is that because of the way society is structured, older people are whiter people, right? Because minorities face more barriers due to the social determinants of health, more comorbidities, and die earlier. It's a very sad and horrific reflection of the way society is structured. So one way of looking at this is to say, well, do I give more health benefits to people who have already had more benefits because they were privileged in society as it is organized? Or do I give more health benefits to essential workers who are more likely to be minorities, and because society is the way it is, have a reduced life expectancy as it is to start with? So if you just look at reduced deaths, there isn't much of a difference, but there's a number of other considerations, of course, that are at stake, and they're incommensurables in many ways. So that's why we can expect that states will see these trade-offs in different ways.
Great, thank you, Harald. Now I'd like to invite Ruqaiijah Yearby.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we actually allocate and distribute these vaccines. Both of our panelists have talked about some of the issues, and what I want to highlight is that allocation and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines is only a small part of the government response to the pandemic. And although it is an important part right now, particularly as we see that the US has recorded record deaths yesterday from COVID-19, that there's other work that needs to be done, not only in terms of ensuring that the vaccine is equitably distributed and allocated, but also that those who have been harmed disproportionately by the pandemic uptake and actually have support to be able to take the vaccine. And so I just want to highlight that from the start of the pandemic, the government's response has failed to provide protection and support for most of the vulnerable. And this includes those in nursing homes, those that actually provide care in nursing homes, at home to people, people in hospitals, other essential workers, grocery workers, and those who have lost their jobs. And so the time to address those issues are now. As Harald mentioned, that many times during this pandemic, we have often turned away to say that, yes, there are equity issues, but we don't have the time to address them right now. And we can see this in terms of the vaccine trials themselves. And this is the point to ensure that we do not reinforce and replicate these harms as we roll out the vaccine. So a lot of the work that I have been doing during the pandemic has really focused on essential workers and the fact that they have increased rates of infections and deaths, and also around the supports that they need and others who are at home who have been laid off need to make it through this pandemic. And so I'm going to just briefly talk about some of the things that the governments need to do as they roll out, and then looking forward to questions and discussions about this later on. So when we think about the equitable allocation of these vaccines, what we need governments to do is to not only partner with community groups. And when I say partner with community groups, I mean we need them to pay community groups and their members to begin to establish a relationship with the people who are going to get this vaccine who may not think about doing it. Right. And so that looks like not just saying to healthcare workers that it is a requirement for you to continue to work, not just saying to some of these essential workers that it is a requirement for you to continue to work, but to begin to use people who are community health workers, training people to be outreach workers who are in these communities that know their culture, that speak their language, to begin to talk with people about their hesitancy around these vaccines. Not only that, but begin to talk with them about what are the things that they need. Listening to the FDA hearing today, many of the people who testified talked about the need to ensure that we are very clear and supportive about some of the side effects that happen and continue to track it. And so being able to use these workers who are paid and these community groups who should be paid to not only hear what these individuals are thinking about in terms of not getting the actual vaccine, but also begin to talk with them about what else do they need? Do they need food? Do they need water? Are they having issues on their jobs around safety that are not improving because employers think once you get the vaccine, then we don't have to institute some of these protections? And so that's one way that the government can begin to not only work with community groups to show and build support and trust, but also to economically provide support for these communities who have faced financial burdens and harms during COVID-19. Another way, and I just want to highlight some of the states that have been doing this, and I'm pulling this from a review of some of the state reports and also a report that Harald and other authors published about the plans that states have put forth to work with communities. And so when we look at states like North Dakota and Michigan, they have begun to mention in their plans that they are going to be working with community groups, particularly tribal groups, to ensure that the rollout of the vaccines is equitable. And that is a first step. Definitely in terms of even just mentioning that you are going to partner with community groups. In Michigan, they also mentioned that after the first rollout of the vaccine, that they were going to work with community clinics to be able to provide the vaccine to people in areas that perhaps do not have hospitals or major healthcare systems where they can get it. What is missing, however, from this discussion and most discussions of the plans is how they're going to track and support people who suffer from side effects. And I want to highlight this because part of the hesitancy with lots of groups for participating in vaccines and vaccine trials is that it's not transparent about either the side effects or what is going to happen. And so lots of the people who were testifying before the FDA today just talked about the need to continue to track these side effects and the need to be honest about the fact that there are side effects and then provide supports for people, particularly if we are saying that healthcare workers who we need and are in short supply and essential workers, again, who we need and who are in short supply, that they're going to get it first, that we have to be there to provide either support, financial, paid time off, and transparency around any issues that they suffer from undertaking the vaccine. And I think I will stop there just because I want to ensure that we have time for lots of discussion amongst us. But really just want to highlight the fact that as we're moving to roll out, we shouldn't just enforce blanket requirements, that we really need to work with communities who have some hesitancy around vaccine uptake to ensure that we listen to their concerns, we provide supports that they need, food, water, assistance, and that we are transparent and honest about any side effects that happen from the vaccine.
Great. Thank you, Ruqaiijah. As maybe one quick follow-up question to your presentation, so you talked a lot about essential worker. And so if maybe you could talk about potential ways of allocating vaccines to essential workers, is there a possibility that there will be a prioritization amongst the broad category of essential workers that will take place?
I think we have begun to see that already. Um, One, states are not, so who is on the essential worker list in each state is not the same. At the federal level, they issued a guidance, the Department of Homeland Security issued a critical infrastructure list, which had many people on it, but it's different for each state. And so even if we look at the essential workers, in some places you have meat and poultry processing plant workers, some agricultural workers, nursing home workers, home health workers, so it varies. What I think is important, and I heard, I actually attended a webinar where they were talking about the Colorado plan, is what they have begun to do is to parse out who should get it in terms of essential workers, but then also look at other demographics that might make them more vulnerable, right? And so perhaps they are older, perhaps they live in communities that have a higher density, perhaps they have comorbidities. And so one way they've been able to separate out sort of essential workers is to say, you know, if you have additional things that make you more apt to either get the disease or die from the disease, then we would actually, move you up first. I think what is interesting to me in this shift to focus on sort of nursing home care workers, and that not being clear, is that a lot of people who work in nursing homes are traveling nurses and also provide care in home health settings. And so it's not clear to me that we have been clear enough to ensure that we actually provide the vaccine not only for workers who are working in institutional settings, but also workers who are taking care of the most vulnerable in their homes, because we have seen lots of deaths and infections of those workers too. So I think that's still open to debate, but it would be nice if they were clearer about sort of who they are covering.
Okay, and maybe one more question about using the role of engaging community groups and community partners. So there was a question about where would this potential funding come from to support community agencies, community-based groups to help support the work of vaccine allocation.
And so I just want to highlight that some of this, I was actually at a talk yesterday, and Professor Carlos Rodriguez Diaz actually talked about the work that was being done in DC, where they were using people who were out of work as community outreach to begin to work with communities. So part of the money can come from the CARES Act. And so we've already seen before the vaccine rolled rolled out that some governors were using CARES money to provide hazard pay to home health care workers and to provide pay to people who were out there and putting their lives on the line. And certain states, including Missouri, still have lots of money that they have not spent. And so part of the money that is there in terms of care should be used for these outreach groups. My hope is that as Congress and agencies are thinking about rolling out and providing approval for these vaccines, that they think about that in the economic relief bills, that they actually put in money for people to do this outreach. Because the key is you don't want to buy a lot of vaccines that do not get used or go to waste because people are not getting vaccinated. And so at the same time, we think about providing money to actually do the research. We need to think about providing money so it actually gets to the people it needs to get to.
Great, thank you so much. Let's invite back Harald and Anna to the conversation, and we'll start taking some additional questions. Before we do that, I do want to make sure everyone knows that if you have registered for this, you will receive the recording. We will also be have this the recording posted on the Institute's website for you to access later and to share with others as well. So actually, maybe as sort of a question to think about in terms of just general vaccine hesitancy, what have been some recent reports or recent data discussing or talking about people's willingness to take the vaccine? And this is open for anyone.
Well, I can tell you from, in fact, it's a point Ruqaiijah and I have been talking about already also from working with colleagues at Penn in recruiting people for the vaccine trials that also take place at Penn. It's a hugely, as you know, sensitive issue to, on the one hand, ensure that we have enough representation of minority populations among trials, and on the other hand, be mindful of the fact that in many cases, these populations have very good reasons to be mistrustful of engaging with healthcare systems, including our very own one, right? So in reaching out to people, we very often get these responses that people are saying, I'm not going to be one of your guinea pigs. And it's interesting, especially because of the news and everybody on the whole being very enthusiastic about a very effective vaccine, right? I think it just gives you a sense of how deep-seated and ingrained in the collective psyche that is. And it's something that is incredibly important for thinking about how we roll out these vaccines. Because I want to draw your attention to one other piece. When President Trump announced Operation Warp Speed, he made a claim that vaccines would be rolled out swiftly and equitably to everyone. And he said, of course, not everybody will want it. And when he said that, it made my hairs, as so many times, stand up, because I thought, I know where you're getting at. You're constructing a very perverse personal responsibility argument to say, well, if African-American communities don't come forward to get vaccines, then so be it, right? But it's naive to be thinking all we need to do is offer a vaccine and then they will come, right? That's not how it works. We have to be absolutely mindful of the fact that the playing field is not level at all. And hence we have to be mindful of that history and can't just see vaccine hesitancy as some personal preference, but as embedding horrific historic experiences. And so that's, again, where I think we, in fact, a second analysis we're doing of the state analysis, the state allocation plans, is to look at which states refer to historic injustice in justifying their plan. And there's about 10 that mention this point expressly. And that's the elephant in the room, right? Unless you tackle that head on, whether you mention it or not is a separate question, right? But unless you are aware of that, you're not going to accomplish equitable vaccine allocation. So it matters both for the trials that are still ongoing, as well as for the eventual rollout. We can't be blind to history here.
Could we expect that there's going to be additional information sharing about who actually participated in the clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so we only have press release information for the most part. That's really what I think we'll have a much better sense in this week. as you know, both FOSSI has been very insistent from the beginning that we can't just have population representation levels of minorities, but larger representations, right? It gets into power calculations and all sorts of other considerations, what the right number is. But I think it's clear that policymakers have rightly considered that it is important to not simply have your 25-year-old white males be the majority of the trial population. And I think the progress has been encouraging, but again, I'll just say from our own experience, the pace at which this happens, or the reason we got this done so quickly, is because it's frantic. And it's the exact same situation. You try and reach out, we try to reach out to disadvantaged minority populations in West Philly. It takes a lot longer than it takes to recruit someone else. So it's a reflection of the overall pace, but as Ruqaiijah rightly said, none of that is a good excuse to say, sorry, we didn't get it done. It's an incentive to make sure we get it done.
And I would add just a quick caveat, but also, a piece of good news, which is FDA, contrary to the opinion of many legal scholars, considers data submitted in connection with clinical trials to be proprietary and tends not to disclose, the most valuable portion of it. And they don't seem to, they've said they will be more transparent with COVID-19 vaccines and drugs, but we don't quite know what that means. So we don't know if we'll be able to get, the more granular indication about who participated, and what we can glean from those data. We still don't know we'll get that from the FDA. Good news is that EMA, so Europe, the FDA counterpart in Europe, has announced they will release data for COVID-19 vaccines, which kind of gets us around the FDA prohibition, but we still will not have data that's specific to the US. So we can have the more generalizable type of data for efficacy and safety, but we are still going to have probably more limited data on participation on the US side of things because of FDA's position.
And I just wanted to add sort of to your question about sort of this vaccine hesitancy. I think what I would say is that it's just not vaccine hesitancy, right? It's COVID-19 hesitancy, right? We have been through 9 months of a poor governmental response, and not only stopping the spread of the disease, but also providing economic supports, providing people with the things that they need to ensure that they're not infected and that they don't infect their families, right? As well as sort of the support around mental health. And so what is clear to me is that as we roll out COVID-19 vaccines, that we have to address all of those issues, right? And sort of assuming that people don't want to participate just because of either some historical problems or perhaps they, are part of the anti-vaxxer movement is not going to get us anywhere. And it leaves out a major part of sort of the hesitancy, which is, people are asking you to come in and get a shot when they don't understand that your employer is not going to give you time off to actually do it, right? That if there are any side effects for it, then your employer may retaliate against you. And that many of the healthcare workers who are now treating people have been retaliated against because they have been trying to protect themselves. And so at this point, that if you're going to roll it out, you have to provide the supports that people need to address either that retaliation, to be able to come and take the shot, and to actually get food and water, because it takes a while for even the protective, value for the vaccine to kick in. So those are all things that we need to think about as we're rolling out the vaccine.
Thank you. There's a question about prisoners and where they may fall within vaccine priority. And just as sort of thinking about them as a vulnerable population, but also thinking about them in terms of public opinion of this particular group. And I would even add even a question about what should we talk about in terms of the cost or who is going to pay for those vaccines as well. So I'll open it up to any of you.
So on the framework by the National Academies, prisoners were actually grouped in priority group in phase 2 before children and young adults. And in fact, also workers in industries and occupations important to the functioning of society. So some of the essential workers. Okay, so you have a very clear normative commitment there to saying we consider risk more important than social utility in that regard. And think about it, right? Also children. So partly that's driven by the evidence suggesting children aren't as high at risk as you might think otherwise. But there you have it laid out and integrated in the National Academies framework. ACIP has not yet addressed that point, so we don't know anything from them. And it will ultimately, again, be down to states and the other jurisdictions. So there's 64 of these units that will decide on their own. But I think you raised an excellent point there that here you have quite a justification on your plate, right? To say, well, I'm going to give it to prisoners before children, regardless whose children they are. That's not trivial to pull off. But again, to the point that I tried to make earlier, if we're looking at disadvantage as the main driver and we apply that within each of these groups, there's a very good reason for prioritizing prison populations on exactly those grounds, as well as within essential workers.
Thank you. Anna, anything you would like to add about costs?
I will just add that in support of Operation Warp Speed, there's money set aside for vaccination of prison populations. So there is money set aside specifically for that. So I don't think we're going to have any issues with that particular population, which at one point was considered not to be one of the top priority populations, but close to that. And there were discussions in that area. So that one has been budgeted.
Thank you so much, Anna. There's also another question about how communities that may reside in neighborhoods and communities that may not have ready access to healthcare facilities. How will they be? How will those issues be addressed, especially since some of the vaccines will have to be refrigerated?
Yeah, I think it is a harder issue. I think that's why people were excited about the Oxford vaccine because it didn't need those storage requirements. I see many places, including St. Louis, saying that they're going to have, access to the refrigeration. And I think, looking at the state plans, Michigan, that's one of the reasons that they initially said that they would partner with the traditional hospital settings, and all the nursing homes are going to be able to partner with CVS and Walgreens to get it out. So I think that is going to be an issue, particularly as we think about some of the populations that they're trying to get the vaccine to, right? So when we think about essential workers, they often are work in rural areas, agricultural workers, sometimes again, rural areas. And so how are you going to get it out to them? And that's why I think it's so important to begin to partner with these community groups to see how are we going to get it to them. Do we actually need to provide them transportation to places to get it? We've already seen that sort of in the testing of going out to these communities and meeting with them where they are. And it seems more likely that we're going to have to think about transporting them to places to actually get the vaccine, which again then means that you're going to have to work with their employers and just think about the overall process. And that's nothing, and that really doesn't get to some of the tribal issues where they're off on their own land. How do you get it out to them? And this is why it's so important to partner with them and other community groups to figure out what their needs are.
Something that further complicates that, it's not just maintaining your usual refrigeration needed for vaccines, that one of these vaccines is super cold and has such specific requirements from a logistics perspective that Pfizer itself is having trouble just getting enough containers made to order for this. You can open them only a couple times a day, and that's about it. So it's going to complicate. It's not just guaranteeing infrastructure in remote places. Is the company itself is struggling. So one of the things I can share is that the incoming administration is looking into ways. Should this be as bad as it can? As some people say it might be in terms of not these companies not being able to meet demand, they are looking again, because these vaccines are covered by intellectual property rights, at ways in which it might be possible to sub-license the vaccine, both the vaccine and actually things like containers and whatnot, to other companies, so we can have more players just to help us overcome the logistics problems that are so specific to COVID-19 vaccines.
Thank you, Anna. There's one more question that we have in the Q&A. How does the effort to get COVID-19 limitation of liability statutes affecting the evaluation of risk or play into this rollout of vaccines? The person that sent the question said Ohio has one, and McConnell has said to be holding up the stimulus to have this included federally in that package.
From a regulatory perspective, issues of liability should not really play into, the FDA's assessment or the regulator's assessment, right? From a vaccine trust perspective, that's a really, really important question. But from a regulatory risk perspective, the two are connected, but should not weigh in on how the regulator will assess the risk and benefits of the vaccine. The one thing I can add to that generic statement is that, as far as I can tell, every company that is part of Warp Speed, or in Europe, the COVAX procurement mechanism, it was one of the first demands made to governments all over the world that they establish some form of liability protection. The US already has a model. The US and about 20 plus other countries have a model that companies have pushed really hard to be implemented domestically for these vaccines, and that's what I expect will happen. So a no-fault liability regime to be nationally.
Anna, I want to give everyone an opportunity to just offer up a final word. I will go in reverse order. So we'll start with Ruqaiijah, Harald, and then Anna.
Thank you for that. So I would just say, hopefully what people take from us today is that there are lots of issues, and that as policymakers, states are thinking about the equitable allocation of vaccines, they need to do it in a greater context of not just what is happening now, but what has happened in the past, and begin to build relationships with communities and people that they want to actually get this vaccine. And so really, I think the final points are just think about financial, material, and social supports that people need to not only take the vaccine, but to continue to get them through this pandemic.
I'll just agree with that. And the only other thought I'll add is patience. I think we all need a lot of patience. Everybody is annoyed with this pandemic, understandably so. Everybody wants it to be over with, but we have to differentiate between an inconvenience, which is how I would characterize the effect of my own life. I can do all my work pretty much the same. It's an inconvenience. I'd love to see my colleagues again. I'd love to go to a concert, but I can wait a few more months. Whereas other people, literally their livelihood is at stake. And I think that's why we need to be patient and not thinking, oh, I should just jump the queue. It's just me. We should be patient and understand that many other people need a vaccine far more urgently than we do. We all like to think, what is my place in the line for the vaccine? But it's not about us. It's about all of us. And many of us have a much greater need for the vaccine than many others.
And agreeing with both panelists on their final remarks, I think I'd like to end with a shout out to another group here at SLU led by Dr. Ricardo Ray. I'm part of this group that currently has a 70-question survey out in the St. Louis area. And what the study is trying to do is to understand why people might be hesitant about COVID-19 vaccines and getting some more granular information on that. So that's our research agenda for the next couple of months. And I think this is something that we desperately need during the pandemic, but also beyond that, to understand, because we know we don't know enough about why people, we know some of the broad reasons people might not have full trust in FDA approved or authorized vaccines, but we need more legwork to be done before the next pandemic, so we can start local engagements, sooner and do it in more meaningful ways than the ones we're able to do right now. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that team, and we hope to have results to share with you within a few months that will further illuminate this debate and the many things that you see are still on the to-do list for us to get better at responding to pandemics and increasing vaccine trust.
Great. I want to take this time to thank each of you for participating in the Color of COVID series. We thank you for your time. Also, I want to thank each of all of our participants for joining us for this hour. As you can see on the last slide, the email addresses for each of our panelists. If you have additional questions, comments, or requests for resources, please feel free to reach out to them directly. Thank you so much again for your time, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.